How many folks here have experience with 3D printing? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right. So, fairly new crowd to this. Exciting. Cool. It's going to be a fun day. Today's going to be more about the types of behaviors, the ideas, the techniques that this technology enables. If you want to learn more about the technical stuff, I'll make some suggestions as to where to do that. But today we're going to talk more about what this technology is enabling and by way of behaviors in the 21st century, some of the things that may or may not come, and some of the things that you guys are going to be able to go out and experiment with. All right.
Yeah.
So.
Thanks everybody for coming out. Appreciate it. Isaac's leaving town tomorrow, so we had to squeeze him in for an artist talk right after our opening. So I appreciate all coming out.
So this talk's called 21 Terms for the 21st Century. My name is Isaac Budmen. I'm an artist, I'm an author, I'm an inventor, a menagerie of things. You can find me on just about every social network at ibudman. And if you want to tweet at me or tweet anything about this presentation or anything else you have down the road, use the hashtag 21terms. So words are thoughts. That's kind of the premise that we're going to take in the beginning here. Words give shape to the ideas we have in our head. Otherwise, they're just kind of abstract images and we can't communicate them. But we spend all day driving around, sitting at our desk, working on something in front of us, articulating what we want to do next in words. In our heads. So if words are thoughts, then this premise, new words equal new thoughts, isn't that outrageous of a concept, and that new words actually enable new ways of thinking. Language gives shape to the future, if you will. And occasionally a technology comes along that's so different from anything that we've known before that we need new language for it. That using analogies and similes and metaphors conjures up the wrong imagery and isn't necessarily referring to the native technology or native piece of history in front of us. So one man knew this. This gentleman here decided to fly his kite and in the process discover electricity. This is Benjamin Franklin, of course. And Benjamin Franklin knew that electricity was something brand new. It was something that we'd never seen before. It ran like water but was hot like fire. Was it fire water? Was it water fire? I don't know. Those words didn't really do it justice. So Ben Franklin added a whole list of words to our linguistic Rolodex: battery, charge, positively, negatively, conductor, electrician. These are just a few. These are words we all know well. Words that we know uniquely relate to electricity. And the great thing about language is it enables us to talk about the technology. It enables us to understand it in a way that metaphors don't. And so, you know, folks could have been sitting around writing the Constitution. Did you hear what he just said? I'm sorry, what? My hearing aids need new batteries, right? This is language that they didn't have up until that point, and probably not for several hundred years after. But language enables us to do things that we couldn't do otherwise. So I think 3D printing is one of those technologies. It's totally different from anything before it. It's not 2D printing. It's not even milling. It's something entirely different. We've never made products or anything in this way before. And as you can see, it's an additive process. We'll watch that one more time. And layer by layer, we're able to make objects from digital files on a computer. After a short while, you're able to take that object and do whatever you will with it. So let's jump right into it. The first word I'm going to talk about here is scanograph. A scanograph is an object made from 3D capture data. For years and years and years and years, we've had photographs. And we've been able to take a photo and turn it into a photograph. Well, what about a scanograph? Well, this is a leather bowl. It's friends of mine. They love it dearly. And as a gift, I scanned it and turned it into this scanograph. And so they have the little version now. And I work at the Met Museum in New York. And at the Met Museum, there's all sorts of wonderful objects to turn into a scanograph. This is an Umberto Boccioni piece. Here it is as a scanograph. Here we have Ben Franklin, a Houdon piece, I believe. And here he is, sitting next to some beautiful presidential books at home. This is Boy with Ball from ancient Mesopotamia. Here he is as a scanograph. So scanographs enable us to capture our real world in 3 dimensions and bring it with us, to reinterpret it, to reimagine it, perhaps. So you might have noticed that Boy with Ball there didn't necessarily look like the colorful plastic you'll see in that room or the other 3D prints that were there. And that's because Boy with Ball was pseudoed. And pseudoing is to make an object look as if it is made from another material. Why would you want to pseudo something? Well, here we have Frank Lloyd Wright's Midway Garden sprite. And it's finished to look like the stone that the original one was made out of. This is a piece that sits on the Hobart William Smith campus in the small town of Geneva, New York, done by one of the artists and professors there, Ted Aub. And this is actually a pseudoed 3D print of it, taken from the scan, or the scanograph. And what this allows us to do is it allows us to take a 3D printed object, something that is plastic, something that might feel like McDonald's or something you'd buy at Target. And it starts to build a one-to-one continuity with the original subject matter. When you hand someone a piece that has been pseudoed, they're not looking at it as this little plastic thing anymore. They're starting to look at it as a miniature version or a replica version of the real thing somewhere else. And so this starts to build an interesting dialogue. Especially in classrooms, this can be incredibly valuable. You can scan really fantastic, really famous works of art, and you can bring them into the classroom and replicate fairly closely the original piece. This is, again, the Umberto Boccioni piece. Here we have it just unfinished, 3D printed, the scanograph, and here we have the scanograph pseudoed, looking in bronze just like the original piece. Again, the Umberto Boccioni piece 3D printed, and here it is pseudoed. With the pseudoing process, it starts to look a lot like the original piece. It's hard to know that this piece only sits on the desktop and isn't the massive size like the one at the Met. And you can do this with just about any metal material that you can imagine or actually create out there. Here we have an aged piece of bronze up front with a slight patina to it. We've got a little bit of silver, we've got some gold, and we've got some bronze in the back. Again, these are all 3D printed plastic. They aren't actually metal, but it would be hard to tell the difference. So, scan veneer. If we can take a scanograph of something, if we can pseudo it, then if I'm on vacation and I have 3D scanning capabilities and 3D printing capabilities, why would I not make a scan veneer, an object from a 3D scan taken on vacation to be fabricated at home? So, if you ever visit Thomas Jefferson's famed plantation home, as Google thankfully points out for us here, it's called Monticello, and if you've never seen it, take out a nickel and look on the back. You'll actually recognize the dome from the top of the house right there. And so if you go to Thomas Jefferson's house, like I did, and you walk out onto the deck that surrounds it, right up in this corner is a very unique piece. And if we zoomed in on that piece, what we would see is this. And this is a very unique sundial that Thomas Jefferson invented. He designed this and invented this piece, and at the time it was incredibly unusual. Sundials in the United States did not look like this. Now you have to remember weather and time were all local back then. You couldn't turn on CNN or check your phone to figure out what the weather or the time was. So Thomas Jefferson every morning would get up, he'd walk out, he'd look at the sundial, and he'd figure out what time it was and what the weather might look like for that day. And I was really enamored with this piece. I just thought it was the best thing. It was something that he used, it was something he invented, and as one of my idols, I just really became enamored with it. And so I hiked down the hill to the gift shop, and I asked them, hey, do you have the sundial for sale? And they looked at me like, are you crazy? But of course I'm looking at them like they're the crazy ones. They've got Thomas Jefferson erasers and all sorts of other things, but not this piece. So I hiked back up the hill, and I took a series of photos around the outside. From those series of photos, I was able to produce a 3D model. And from that 3D model, I was able to print and pseudo it, and now this sits on my desk at home. And every day I get to look at this scanned veneer from my travels there and remember my day there, and also remember what this meant to him. And in the future, this is probably going to be a more common behavior. So the way I do this is with 123D Catch. If you have an iOS or an Android device, I highly recommend you download it. And all it does is you take photos around a sculpture, around an object, around a person. And from those photos, we're able to stitch together a 3D model, and it does it for you. It doesn't always turn out perfect, requires some experimentation, but as you do more and more of it, you get a little bit better. But this is just right now. This is possible today. But what about 2 years from now? Well, Google's already thinking about it. Google's got this great product coming out called Project Tango. And if we look, we have a typical cell phone here. And on one side, you can see the image of the room that's being looked at. Over here, we have a depth map. Google's building 3D scanners into phones. You're going to be able to go to the Louvre. You're going to be able to go to the Met. You're going to be able to go to Disney World. And you're going to have a 3D scanner in your phone, and you're going to be able to 3D scan whatever's in front of you. Imagine how that changes things. So our next word, Busty. As long as we're talking about scanning, we need to talk about Busties. Busties are a fabricated 3D likeness of oneself, typically captured using 3D scanning. Bust and selfie. Mash them together, what do you get? So people really like these. Here, I believe they're called shelfies, and you can get them done in the other room. Talk to Matt and Lena about that. But folks really like these. This is a unique way to capture yourself and really see yourself. I mean, most of the time, you've only seen yourself in 2D. You've seen it in a mirror, you've seen it in an image, but you've never seen the back of your head. And most people go, wow, do I really hunch like that? So I've done a lot of these. Folks like them. Here we have some older folks. There we have a kid. It's just a fun way to kind of look at yourself. And I mean, I like to think about some of us who have babies, scanning those babies and watching them grow up in scanograph form or Busty form here. And if you really want to, you can make these into holiday ornaments. This was my gift to my parents. Hope you are hanging with the ones you love this season. So, Busties. Dronographs. So, you know, we're talking about scanographs, we're talking about scan veneers, we're talking about Busties. A lot of these relate to capturing our 3D world and reimagining it, reinterpreting it in plastic and bits as much as they are atoms. So a dronograph is a scanograph of an object captured by drone. We all know what drones are, and we know the FAA is very worried about them, but they're a lot of fun in the meantime until the laws catch up. So we started to wonder what would happen if we were able to 3D scan a building. So this is Holden Observatory. I'm from Syracuse, New York, and this is on Syracuse University's campus. This is one of the oldest buildings on campus. It was built in the 1800s. And this seemed to be the perfect opportunity to try and do this. So just to give you a sense of scale, that's me down there in the corner. That is the building. And what we ended up doing was we took a drone. This is me, and this is our drone pilot here, although I'm holding the remote. I promise you I was not driving it. I was just directing the photo capture. This is Arlen Whitfield. If you're interested, follow him at ArlenW. But here we have the process of how this happens. We attached a camera to the bottom of the drone, and we decided to fly it around the building over and over and over again, trying to capture every angle possible, take as many photos as we possibly could. This took us about 2 days, 2.5 days, and we got some funny looks from campus security and several people stopping by to go, what are you doing with that? But ultimately, we were able to capture this building. And so if you're curious, this is kind of the flight that the drone took. You can see we moved around the outside. We have those trees right against the building. There's nothing we can do about that. And we kind of worked our way up as we moved around, and we just kept doing this over and over and over again. And eventually we worked our way all the way up to the top where we were looking straight down to get all of the vantage points we possibly could cover. The same way that I would scan Ben Franklin at the Met. Ultimately, this produces a 3D model, and here we have it pseudo to look like the real one. This is 3D printed. So this was, to my knowledge, the first building 3D scanned solely for the purpose of 3D printing. And this is our first dronograph. And you see we captured the trees, we captured the dome, and so this is a pretty cool thing. And I like to think about what happens if you capture a building over 100 years. You would see the age, you would see the way the bricks crumbled, you would see the renovations that were done in a way that you wouldn't be able to in a photograph. And what happens when you can scan the deterioration of the pyramids of Giza and in classrooms everywhere print those out? How does that change our students' understanding and learning about the world around them? Dronographs. Mesh. Well, remix. We live in a remix culture. Kanye West likes to repeatedly remind us of that. But a mesh is to combine 2 or more computed 3D meshes. Photoshop has been a dominant force in the graphics world for the last 20 years, and Photoshop is even a verb now. Oh, I photoshopped my head onto Mount Rushmore. Well, what happens when we can do that with 3D models? Well, we get a mesh mash. So what happens when you put Isaac together with a Rodin? Well, you get, there's the Rodin, Isaac walking. Right? Or Isaac with Abraham Lincoln. You get Isaac Lincoln. Or, you know, Isaac and a headless pharaoh. Well, you get Isaac headless. But this is one of those things that if photoshopping and the number of apps out there to put your face on various icons and landmarks, this is probably a very popular behavior in this century as well. Mesh mashing. So I said I work at the Met, and I do, and it's a lot of fun. And I highly recommend going there. But if you go to the Met, this is what you're going to see. This is a gallery, fairly typical. I believe this is the wing that houses Monet and Van Gogh. And so, but this is kind of what it looks like, right? And I want you to notice, kind of just observe these photos here in a second. This is MoMA. This is the Matisse Cutout Show. And this is the Louvre. What do we notice about all three of these? Anyone? What types of things are in the gallery? Paintings. And paintings are two-dimensional. Most of the thought from human history is stuck in 2 dimensions. It's paintings, it's drawings, it's even cave drawings, right? Humans have been thinking about amazing things for a really long time, but it's really hard to make something 3D. It's a little bit easier to paint it. I don't want to say that Mona Lisa was easy to paint. I don't believe that for a second. But a lot of our ideas are captured in 2D. Well, with 3D printing makes it really easy to begin to create objects in 3D and to take ideas that were previously 2D and bring them into 3 dimensions. And so I think we need a word for this, to dimensionalize, to add a dimension. So if you were going to dimensionalize a 2D thing, it would become 3D. If you're going to dimensionalize a 3D thing, it'd be 4D, 4D, 5D, and so on, but we're not there yet. But dimensionalize. So I'll give you an example of this. This is Picasso's Nude by the Sea, kind of a departure from the rest of his work. And when he painted this, he actually intended this to be a giant sculpture on the beaches at Cannes. And his dealer said to him, well, why are you painting that? And Picasso said, well, no one will commission me to make it, so I need to paint it so someday it can be made. Well, I saw this piece at the Met, and I was just taken with it. It looks like a sculpture. It looks like it should be standing. So after spending some time staring at the brushstrokes, contemplating the form, doing some study sketches, I dimensionalized this piece. And now for the first time, this young lady is able to stand on 2 feet all by herself, and we'll make her do a little spin for us. But this is a dimensionalized piece from a Picasso painting. And so, you know, this doesn't only have to be done with art from the last century. This could be done with art from this century. And it's become one of the great joys of my life is dimensionalizing. So I'd like to introduce you to an artist named Adam Lister. Adam does 8-bit inspired watercolor paintings. This is Walter White from Breaking Bad. And I like his work because it reminds me to smile. You know, Adam does some really great things. Here we have Derek Jeter. And is my remote going? There we go. We'll go back here. So ultimately, I saw this painting from Adam, and I thought, wow, I've never seen something stand in. There we go. Mona Lisa, Forrest Gump, Derek Jeter. Kind of a cultural Rorschach test, if you will. Willy Wonka, and ultimately our pigeon here. And so I saw this pigeon from Adam, and I thought, wow, that looks like it could be standing in 3D. That needs to be dimensionalized. So asked him, can we dimensionalize this? And he was all about it, and here we have the pigeon dimensionalized. I gotta move this. And, oh, geez, this thing is freaking out on me now. I apologize. So here we have it dimensionalized, right? And this thing stands on its own. Maybe this will do it. I don't know why it's... give me a second. There we go. So this thing stands on its own, and hopefully in just a second it'll walk towards us here. There you go. And so this is a slightly different process than the printers in here. This is a full color print, and that happens all at once. If you have questions about that, remind me after the talk, and I'm happy to answer. But so here we have the print fully dimensionalized. I'll give you one more example of dimensionalization here. Back in the turn of the century, just before the 20th century here, the Eiffel Tower went up. And everybody in London was like, we're screwed. Everybody's going to go to Paris. Nobody's going to come to London. So we need to build a tower to rival that of the Eiffel. And they put this call out in the local newspaper. And they asked for submissions for people to design a tower that rivaled that of the Eiffel. And there was some fairly imaginative submissions. I think there was 150 submissions in total. Some of them are wildly imaginative, just really bizarre stuff. And there's this great archive of all of this work that was never actually realized. Some of them not so imaginative. But ultimately, I ended up seeing... I might have to restart this quickly. Give me just a second. Let's see if this works. If need be, I'll just move the computer over. One more time. Are you going to work for me or are you going to fight me? I apologize for the technical difficulties here. We're working on the cutting edge, if you will. So here you go. This was the piece that jumped out at me, and it was like, that really needs to be dimensionalized. And so this is shared online, and folks in classrooms can download both the original print and the 3D print, and they can talk to students about both. And so I encourage students and anybody else to walk around, think about the 2D information that surrounds you, that you see every single day, and think about what you could do to dimensionalize that. So, if it's so easy to bring something into 3D, if it's so, and it is, and actually realize it as an object, well, we need a word for what happens when you don't do it from painting or a 2D object, but something inside your head. That word is imaginized, to make something real from your imagination. So, this is a guy that I was doodling in my notebook. You know, I love Lost in Space and the 1950s sci-fi, and so this was a robot that I kind of had in my imagination. Well, I drew him out, and I got to work, and here he is, imaginized, and I call this guy Dudley, the delightful daily university living electric employee. He's actually in the gallery next door if you want to see him. But so here he is, imaginized. This is him with his first box, slightly different than the one next door. But if it's so easy to do this, we need this word, imaginized. Well, one day I was looking at the clouds. I was walking around, and I kept thinking about how awesome would it be if there was this giant factory up in the sky, just producing clouds, giant cumulus clouds. And so I couldn't get this idea out of my head. I came home and I kind of scratched out this drawing of it. And shortly thereafter, I was able to 3D model it, and there it is 3D printed. And this is Cloud Factory. And so it's been imaginized. Starts up here, and very quickly you can hold it in your hand. And you can also see this piece next door. I'll give you just one more example of imaginization. So I went on a ski trip with my brothers and my family, and we were up in Vermont in the Green Mountains. And I kept getting to the top of the mountain, and I kept looking out. And I couldn't help it, but I just kept looking at these beautiful striations of the mountains going back and forth, and I wanted that. I wanted to look at that every single day. And so I came home, and I kind of got this idea, well, what if I could put things between the mountains? What would that look like? And here's the Green Mountain Organizer imaginized. And so this allows me to see the Green Mountains every day. But imaginization, when you can make things from your imagination that quickly, we need a word for it. If you're dimensionalizing, you're imaginizing, and you are scanning things and creating scanographs, and you're pseudoing, and you're doing a lot of experimentation. Well, 3D printing is not a perfect process, and you're bound to get some fails. And if you get fails, you're bound to get some of this stuff in here, and this little teeny tiny stringy stuff, and what I call this is filighetti. Strings of filament from a failed 3D print, and if you do enough of it, you will end up with a lot of it. And it's not really good for too much. I mean, cats love it, so if you have a cat, it will end up all over your house. But ultimately, you end up with a lot of failed 3D prints. It's the nature of the technology right now, and it's for the foreseeable future. So what do you do with failed 3D prints? Well, you make a failture, a sculpture comprised of failed 3D prints. So this is Estelle. She's a very pretty little girl. She has her skirt on there, her tutu. She's got flowers in her hair. She's going out for a date. This is her chauffeur. I call him Bugs. And she was going to meet this young, handsome gentleman, Wabi. And the two of them liked each other so much they're now an item. These are failtures, and it's just one option for taking these failed 3D prints and recycling them into art. So I'd like to introduce you to an individual who I discovered and really kind of took me on a thought journey that I was not anticipating. This is Carlo Scarpa. Carlo Scarpa is most well known for his architecture. He's often called the Frank Lloyd Wright of Italy. You can see he really loves geometry, but what Carlo Scarpa is most well known for is what we now know as Venetian glass. Carlo Scarpa spent a lot of time in his life playing with glass, exploring glass, and really getting familiar with the material and the process of making glass. Well, right when I got to the Met a few years ago, there was a display much like this of Carlo Scarpa's Venetian glass. And to most patrons who were hustling along to Picasso and Van Gogh, this looked like Pier 1 imports, and very few people were stopping to look at it. But I was curious, so I stopped and I spent some time really trying to understand what I was looking at. Why was this stuff in the Met? Well, as it turns out, Carlo Scarpa wasn't sitting around thinking about, oh, I want to make glass with stripes in it. I want to make glass with dots in it. What Carlo Scarpa was doing was he was experimenting with a process. He was experimenting with a material, and he was discovering that by doing some very specific things, you produce some very interesting aesthetic results. And all of these are a byproduct of a process, more so than the idea of an original work and forcing a material to look that way. And so I started to think about what happens if you take a material and you take a process and you really begin to dissect it and get familiar with it and intimate with it. What could come from that? Well, if we do that with 3D printing, we start to get some really interesting things. And the first one is an articuform, a multi-part articulating object that prints pre-assembled. So you'll see these flat-laying hexagons here, but these are actually articuforms. And if you look, right here, here, and here, there's little teeny tiny connectors holding them all together. Now these print this way. They don't have to be assembled. I don't have to print them in multiple parts and put them together. This comes right off the print bed like this. And they articulate. They can do all sorts of things. Now, you can do an incredible amount with articuforms. Just this past year, a dress was made using lots of teeny tiny articulating pieces like chainmail. Bearings have been produced this way, and if you know anything about producing a bearing, it involves lots of teeny tiny little BBs and a very powerful press to push the whole thing together. Well, that takes a lot of time, that's a lot of steps, that's a lot of different pieces that all need to be fabricated and brought together. With 3D printing, you can make a bearing in about 45 minutes. So for those of you who are technical and want to try this, I'll give you just a little glimpse here. What you have to do is you create these cavities where you have a pin facing in one and the hole for the pin to sit in. And as long as you have a 2 millimeter gap in your model, 0.2 millimeter gap in your model, these will print layer by layer by layer without fusing together or toppling over on each other. The other piece is that these need to be at exactly 45 degrees. If you go over 45 degrees, the plastic will spill over and they'll start to fuse together. But as long as you stay within 45 degrees, as this builds up layer by layer by layer, it won't spill over. You can get this beautiful stair-stepping effect, and you can build objects like this. The next one is Mykia. One of the biggest criticisms of 3D printers is they make things about the size of a loaf of bread. Well, To the people who see that as a limitation, I say you need to think outside the box, literally. And so this is an object that prints flat and needs to be assembled to its final form. These are just what I call hexanecks. They're flat little hexagon connectors with these little slots in. And you can see they come off the bed just like this. They kind of print laying flat like that. And they only take a few minutes to print because they are so flat. Well, these can be assembled, and they can build some seriously big structures. We could fill up this whole room with a hexaneck construction, even though they all printed on a machine that's only this big. So Mykia objects, something to think about if you're looking to do something big with a tool that seemingly only does things small. Another one, printagami, an object that prints flat and folds into its final form. Plastic is malleable. It's one of the great things about plastic. It's flexible. We can make bumpers out of it, and they don't crack right away. We can do all sorts of things with plastic. I mean, cracks, right? But printagami takes advantage of that. And instead of origami, where you have to really be aware of the folds that you're going to create, with printagami, we can program those folds into the object as it manufactures. So if you look at this, maybe you can kind of guess what this is going to become. Here's the other piece of it. You can see where those hinges are. You can see where it's kind of dug out a little bit, allowing it to fold. And ultimately, when these pieces come together, you have a butterfly. So printagami, all sorts of things could be made this way. Programmatic hinges, if you will. Our next one is a Symbot, an object that combines 3D printed parts with non-3D printed parts. Well, 3D printing can make a lot of really cool things. It can't do some things, and some things are better left to other manufacturing processes. Steel, for example. You can print steel, but it's not going to come out smooth the way a rod will. Electronics. You can print electronics, but they are going to be fairly ugly, bulky, and they're not really going to fit the way that they do inside your iPhone. So a Symbot is an object that takes these 3D printed parts and really combines them with something else to do something interesting. Well, this is the crystal controller for the interactive art synthesizer. This was a collaborative project between myself and a teacher in Ohio named Josh Ojima. If you want to follow him or actually look up his blog, he's Design, Make, Teach, and I highly recommend it. So this is an interactive art synthesizer. What does that mean? Well, you can see these little electronic leads on the top, and what those are touch capacitive sensors. And so when you touch it, all of a sudden you make an electrical connection, and it does something on this screen. Well, this is a painting I did, and it's called Perceptive Transition, and it's got all these intersecting lines. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to digitize this piece, so we did. And here you have it in a vector form. And as folks touched the leads on the top, they were able to remix this art within certain parameters, and they would have this audio-visual kind of experience. And if I turn this up, we can actually see someone play with this. So you have the controller up front there. So this is a Symbot. Here's another Symbot. This is Slide. And Slide is a camera slider. How does Steven Spielberg get those slippery smooth shots? Well, he uses a camera slider. Of course, his cameras cost a whole lot more money, and his rails cost a whole lot more money. But here we have 3 3D printed connectors, 1, 2, 3, and we have these 2 steel rods. And this Symbot can go back and forth very easily, this slide, and you can get those slippery smooth shots on your iPhone. Well, one of the great things about 3D printing is you can make one, or you can make 1,000 of the same thing, or you can make 1,000 different things all for the same price. And that's what brings me to my next one, because Slide is not only a Symbot, but it's a thingstagram, a thing designed to have easily customizable parameters. Slide back and forth to adjust your filter or to adjust your objects. So Slide can actually be adjusted to work for any cell phone, which seemingly changes every 6 weeks. So, a thingstagram. What else is a thingstagram? Well, this is what I call the word sculpture. You might know Robert Indiana's love sculpture. And I'm sure if he was alive today, he'd want to wring my neck, because I created this little program that allows you to type in any 4-letter word, and it will generate a 3D model in this form factor that allows you to 3D print this object. And so this is the word sculpture, and it's a thingstagram. A lot of people have done this. Meow. And actually, this is up on Thingiverse. If you haven't checked out Thingiverse, it is the universe of things, and it has all sorts of 3D models for download And you can actually customize that Thingstagram right there. And people have. So these are all made by other folks. I believe these are initials to a school. This is a man named Kyle who wanted his name, a surf enthusiast. I believe this is another school, someone who's very enthusiastic from the maker movement. This guy's name is Rick. This girl, I believe, makes props and also eats them for breakfast. And here we have just a few more. Andy, Reed. So this is a Thingstagram. And these are, if you think about the future, the possibility for this stuff, being able to easily design an object by dragging some sliders, picking some parameters. Well, think about all the things that could do. Well, what else could that do? Well, this is OpenStock, and this is a parametric 3D printed sandal and Thingstagram. This is also on Thingiverse. All you have to do is measure the width of your foot, put that number in, measure the length of your foot, put that number in, and it generates a perfect sandal for your foot. You don't have to settle for that off-the-shelf fit anymore. And I call them OpenStocks because they are open source and anyone can use these and create these. And I like to say OpenStock. Walk a smile in these shoes. I'll give you one more example of a Thingstagram. This is Clasp. Clasp is a watch band. This is 3D printed, and you measure the size of the pins on your watch, you measure the size of your wrist, you put them together, and it generates a perfect model for your wrist. No more off-the-shelf fit. And this is available on Thingiverse too. You can go home tonight and you can print these out. So these are all kind of behaviors unique to 3D printing, unique to the technology. And I'll give you some more here. So Streety. The effect of an object fabricated using large, thick 3D printed layers. Most of the time when we're 3D printing, we're trying to get as few or as thin a layer as possible. The thinner the layer, the smoother the surface. But the thinner the layer, the more layers you have to print, the longer it takes. Personally, I'm a little impatient. I want things to fabricate fast, and the thicker the layer, the fatter the layer, the faster it prints. And so if we have this great technology that allows us to print things in layers, then I'm personally interested in embracing layers and letting objects print quickly and to see how those produce. Well, I think it produces this really interesting aesthetic, a super strata aesthetic, if you will. And these fat layers actually work in two ways. Not only are they aesthetically interesting and moving print faster, but because they are fatter layers and come out of a thicker nozzle, they have more surface area. That means that these objects are more durable. And these could be used to make things that thinner layers might become unlaminated. So Streety items, they end up having these really interesting, almost striations in a rock style finishes to them. And if you get it right and you line them up just right, calibrated, you get some really interesting geometric things happening. Streety. The next one is glitch eyes, to deliberately introduce surface inconsistencies to a 3D printed object. A lot of what you hear people talking about when they first start learning to 3D print is, oh, that was a glitch. There's a piece sticking out here that shouldn't be. Oh, that shouldn't be a hole there. Oh, that doesn't look right. Well, what happens when you use a glitch deliberately? When you intend for the effect to not be perfect? Is it a glitch anymore? Well, to glitch eyes is to deliberately introduce these things. And this is a glitchized vase, and if I can get this next image up, you'll see it's got this really interesting, almost organic texture to it. Now, one of the things that is one of the biggest criticisms of any digital art, whether it's photos, 3D printed objects, or any other form of digital art, is that it's infinitely replicable. And I know we place a lot of value on original works here in the art world. Now, I'm not here to debate whether that's a good thing or a bad thing or what authenticity is, but I can tell you that when you glitch eye something, it never prints the same twice. And so by developing a glitchized object, an object that's going to have these surface inconsistencies, you can print the same job 1,000 times and it will come out different every single time. This object was created by running the extruder way too fast. By running it so fast, it had this really interesting effect of blobbing and stringing and blobbing and stringing and blobbing and stringing. And if you begin to explore the behavior of the extruder in this way, you can produce really interesting results. On the flip side of this, glitchized and Streety, where there's this incredible rich texture, you can do this really interesting other thing called vaporoso, the appearance given to an object exposed to a chemical vapor bath, eliminating the layer visibility. Well, what does this look like? So here we have an object printed in ABS plastic. This is just a vase, and ABS plastic is what your Legos are made out of. Well, ABS has this really unique property of softening and starting to dissolve in acetone. So if you take this object and you place it inside a chamber that has acetone vapor in it, all of a sudden you get this really smooth, uninterrupted surface that looks injection molded. It almost looks like glass. And this is the vaporoso process. I'll show you some more here. This is that Umberto Boccioni piece, and you can see the stepping of the layers as it printed. Well, once we give it the vaporoso treatment, you lose those layers, and you start to get this smooth, beautiful object. Here we have his knee, post-vaporoso process, and we'll do one more here. You have the back, the arches, and you can actually see where some of these inconsistencies happened. But once we give it that vaporoso treatment, beautiful, smooth, uninterrupted surface. Well, what happens if you do the vaporoso process too long and your object starts to really soften? Well, you get what's called an intoxo object, deformation caused by excessive exposure to a chemical vapor bath. So here we go through this process again. We have the original object, our vase. We give it the vaporoso treatment. It becomes smooth. And we leave it in just a little bit longer, and you get your intoxo object. And again, this is a process that will never be able to be repeated twice from object to object to object, giving that piece of originality to an otherwise digital and repeatable process. So this is intoxo, and I think it produces some really beautiful results. But if you're wondering where the name came from, I had printed these Eames stools, and this one was in just long enough. This one I walked into the other room in my workshop, came back, and he'd had a few too many drinks. So as long as we're talking about this originality piece, this one-off, right, which is what collectors are looking for. They want a one-off. They want that original piece that nobody else has. Well, roboticin, an object designed to be minutely different each time a robot fabricates it. By understanding the limitations of this process, the layering process, you can start to do this. And so let's take a look at this 3D model. This is a vase, and you'll see that each one of the little loops here doesn't have any material supported underneath it. Now, we know that the layering process happens one by one by one. What happens if we try and print something without anything underneath it? It doesn't have any support, so it's obviously not going to print nice and horizontal like this. So when this object prints, it starts to get these really unique, really kind of interesting sagging or drooping loops on the outside. And this is a roboticin object. Every time you print this object, they're not going to come out the same. You can see even amongst these, they didn't come out the same. Some only have 2, some have 3, some have 5. And so this is a really unique way of producing original art and original work by kind of building it into the object, by letting the process take over. So, recognizing 3D printing as a process, I'll give you our last word here, structure it. To design an object to show the inside scaffolding by not printing the top layers. Well, if you 3D print an object, you have this really great option to decide how dense the interior is. So this is a box. And if we printed this box, we could decide whether to make it a solid brick of plastic. Now, that wouldn't really make a lot of sense. Or we could fill it in with what's called infill. And we can set that on a percentage from 0 to 100. A 0 infilled box would be a totally empty box. But what about a 10% infilled box? Well, if we look at what the computer sees or what the 3D printer sees, this is how it works. It starts by drawing the outside. So we have the outside of our box. This is just one cross-section that it's going to print. After the print head has printed the outside of the box, it begins to print this infill. And here we can see it's done in a hexagon pattern. So it's going to fill in 10%. Now, if it was denser, these hexagons would be smaller. We could go to 20%, 30, 40, 50, 60, all the way up to 100. And every time we went up, these hexagons would get smaller, and the infill would get more dense, and your object would be heavy. Well, what happens if you don't hide this? You leave it open. You don't print the top layers of your object. It's a really interesting effect, right? This is that same cube. We have it printed. See those layers you just draw. And but we haven't finished the left. What could you do? This makes a great pencil holder. Or a torch device inside. Right? And here it is. Here bigger. This is a larger. My calculator, screwdrivers, and everything else. It just sits on my desk. I look down. You can actually see how that works. Now, I wonder about the other things you could do with this. Could you create lampshade displays, diffusing the light by changing the density of the infill? Could you create things beyond this? So it's actually kind of appropriate that we end on an image of tools, because we've got 21 new tools. 21 new tools for the 21st century. Words are thoughts. They enable new thinking. They enable us to have discussions we couldn't have previously. And I hope you're all now thinking about things you couldn't have thought about before you walked into this room. You've got these 21 new tools in your linguistic toolbox. So what I would encourage you to do is think about them. Share them with other people. Experiment with them. And go on and experiment yourself. And when you realize that you've stumbled upon something that doesn't yet exist, that is a new process or a new technique, come up with a new word and share it with us. So my name is Isaac Budmen. You can find my personal website at teambudman.com. If you want to find some of my artwork, I don't yet have it up there, but you can go to budman.com and you can sign up to be on my email list when my work actually is for sale. I am also the co-author of the book on 3D printing. My co-author's in the corner there, so if I am busy answering questions, you can ask that guy in the blue shirt. And this has been 21 terms for the 21st century. I'll open it up for any questions, comments, concerns, speculation that you guys might have. Thank you. Anybody? It's a lot to take in. Yes? Yes. So that's a great question. 3D printing is a broad umbrella. It means to additively manufacture something. And that just means to successively add material, right? But what I have been focused in is called fused filament fabrication or fused deposition modeling. If we break that down, you have fused, right? You're fusing something together, in this case plastic. Filament. Matt, could you grab a roll of filament to hold up? Filament is just plastic. It kind of looks like what goes in the bottom of your weed whacker. And fabrication. So you're taking this plastic, you're pulling it into a hot nozzle, layer by layer by layer. The plastic extrudes, and you end up with a fabricated object. And that is where I've been focused for the last several years. There are several other forms of 3D printing. The most popular ones being SLA and SLS. SLA allows you to have a vat of resin. And that resin will cure when a laser or a digital light projector projects into it. And you can print layer by layer by layer from that resin into an object. If you have questions about that process, the gentleman in the blue shirt here is the expert there, and I would talk to him. His name is Steven. The other process that is very popular at the moment is the SLS process. And that is how our pigeon got made. And that works by having a powder, a very fine-grained powder. And that powder gets laid across a bed. On top of that, a laser comes across and hardens that powder together, fuses it together. Again, another layer comes across the powder, fuses the next layer together. Another layer of powder, laser comes across, fuses the next cross-section together. So when it finishes printing, you actually have a giant block of powder that you have to excavate your object from. The reason that the pigeon is done in full color is because using that process, you can actually send an inkjet head across with each layer and color that powder as it prints. And it ends up feeling very much like sandstone. So I have done a little bit of experimentation with the SLS process. I've done very little with the SLA process. But if you're interested in these materials, what I encourage you to do is go home, go to shapeways.com, and upload a model, because Shapeways provides these very expensive machines. Those machines cost upwards of $50,000, way up into close to the millions and beyond. But what Shapeways does is they buy up these industrial printers that guys like myself can't afford, and they charge you just to print the object you want to print, and I highly recommend trying that. Any other questions?
So what's the cost involved just to select you already have the 3D image to reproduce that image?
So if I've already got the object and I wanted to print it,
Yes.
well, so there's a lot of factors in that, and I can break those down, kind of give you a general overview. One of the main factors is how much plastic you're going to end up using. So we talked about infill. If I wanted a 100% infilled object that would be super dense, it's going to cost me a lot more than if I only fill it in 10%. Now, why would I want an object that was 10% versus 100 besides cost? Something like this, or a bust, or an art object, doesn't really need to be that heavy. It's not going to get abused a lot. It's mostly going to sit on a pedestal or on display. But if I'm producing mechanical parts, I need a dense object. I need something that's going to be durable. So something like this, just for cost reference, I'm guessing that this is about 15 to 20 cents worth of plastic. When you get into the other processes, SLA and SLS, they start to go up exponentially because you have to offset the cost of the machine, and those materials are very proprietary. This, like I said, is just ABS or PLA, and it's the lowest common denominator of polymers out there. So it can be very cheap compared to having something fabricated in plastic even just 5 or 6 years ago. Anything else? If that's all you've got for right now, I'll be hanging out for a while. And like I said, he's around, and if you have questions about the other processes, ask Stephen. And I also will have books for sale here. I believe they're $12.99. $12.99. So I'm happy to sell you a copy. Or if you don't want to buy one here, they're on Amazon or in Barnes & Noble. So guys, thank you for coming. And if you want to get in contact with me, please just look me up through my website.
Thank you.
Actually, I had a question about
We'll open up the gallery next door too. You guys are welcome to see the exhibit next door and see some projects.
when you showed